Wow, well, thank you. Jeffrey gave me the challenge of trying to demystify carbon. He gave me about 10 minutes to do so bear with me. Let's see how we go. We had a really great panel discussion then, and it really came through that a mechanism to support monetising carbon is what's needed. So here, let me see how this all works. Apologies. So what is carbon accounting? Let's bring it all the way back to the start. So in biomethane production, carbon accounting refers to the process of quantifying and tracking the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the entire life cycle production of biomethane. I think it's really important to call out that none of us are saying this is carbon free, it's just a low carbon alternative. So how do we compare that? So here, us at BANZ, at the Bioenergy Association, see biomethane playing a critical role in decarbonising energy systems. And to realise its full value, we need to understand the metrics and the rewards of the emissions profile. As biomethane becomes a central component into the decarbonisation strategies across the energy, transport and agriculture, the frameworks to measure and monetise its climate benefits are coming into shape and focus, into sharper focus. So, for project developers and investors and policymakers, it's essential to understand the carbon intensity and its value. So that comes to what is carbon intensity. So if we look at the whole production chain of biomethane, carbon is needed to make the biomethane or biomass. And essentially the carbon from its production is attached to that gas. Knowing what this carbon amount is enables the biomethane to be compared to fossil natural gas in an apples per apples kind of component or of an emissions factor. So the amount of carbon attached will differ depending on the boundaries of what's included and what's the feedstock, how it's processed and where it is. And for injection of biomethane, the energy component, we've already heard today, is essentially identical, but what will change is the carbon intensity depending on its facility and the amount of greenhouse gases produced during its production. And that's measured in grams of CO2 per megajoule of energy. So this value is derived from a life cycle assessment, or LCA, which has been referred to a few times already today, which quantifies emissions across all stages of this biomethane production. So importantly, carbon intensity calculations must initially define a system boundary. And with the cradle to gate, which is demonstrated there, them being the globally accepted mechanism. And this includes all the different processes of direct processing emissions from biomethane leakage, combustion, and upstream emissions from feedstock transport and electricity use. So what it considers and what it leaves out. So while carbon intensity is useful, it doesn't reflect all the carbon benefits, especially emissions avoidance beyond the boundary. So while these avoided emissions are real and impactful, they are intentionally excluded from this carbon intensity calculation, and that's really due to several different factors around system boundaries. So the LCA for the carbon intensity adheres to strict boundaries. Avoided emissions sit outside of these. We're avoiding double counting risk, so including avoided emissions in carbon intensity calculations could potentially include double counting of carbon, and regulatory clarity, so to enable trading schemes required predictable and audible metrics to be. So that comes into then the question about what is avoided emissions. So, and why do they matter? These are excluded factors can still be valuable. So carbon avoidance and avoided emissions refer to the emissions that would have occurred in a counterfactual or a business as usual situation to how they're being utilised, opposite. So these include things like the use of biomethane versus fossil gas. So you're avoiding the emissions from burning the fossil gas, or you're avoiding the emissions of utilising synthetic fertilisers versus biodigesters. So what has the Bioenergy Association done? So with Bioenergy Association and has engaged with Toitu, and they're the brains trust of this. So we're very lucky to have Dustin here with us today. Give us a wave, Dustin. He's the brains behind this all. Any technical questions, he's the man to go to. We've developed an initial standard carbon intensity methodology. So Toitu are leaders in the carbon accounting space here, so very lucky for them to have been involved. And this is the initial step to standardising defining a boundary of what's included and what's excluded when we're looking at biogas and biomethane projects. So this has been an integrated project that has been led by industry steering group, which I think there's been quite a lot of you in the room here as well have been included, providing the foundation to enable and commence gas trading. So hopefully the GIC will be utilising some of this work. So this provides a framework to compare biogas, biomethane production in a like-for-like process. So what's included, what's excluded. The steering groups involved representatives from across the development chain. This initial project has only really focused on the 3 current methods of biogas, biomethane production seen in New Zealand, being landfill gas, wastewater treatment and purpose-built facilities. But BANZ is currently working on phase 2 and phase 3, which will involve expanding the scope to look at other things like energy crops and also really standardising that avoided emissions aspect. So finally, just some takeaways. So have you considered carbon within your process? This is a standard method to ensure everyone is counting the same way. Carbon intensity enables comparing biogas or biomethane with fossil gas. Avoided emissions account for a wider landscape and still can add value. Assessing your carbon intensity project today will enable you to benefit in the future. Double counting, avoid it if you can, clearly allocated value streams and aligned to market and regulatory pathways. So thank you everyone. A little plug for the Bioenergy Association. Great work that Brian has here, and our chair, Alsbeta, for the Biogas Interest Group. If you're not part of it, I encourage you to come and participate. Thanks.
Thanks, and so that's very helpful, and I think it's helpful to have a succinct explanation of what carbon intensity is and isn't. And so, if I understand correctly, the work that's been done on the carbon intensity is the carbon intensity of the biomethane produced in New Zealand.
Yes.
And work hasn't been done on avoided emissions because that differs according to the use case.
Yes. Yes.
So, if someone who is wanting to get the most value out of biomethane wants to take advantage of avoided emissions, what's the pathway for that in New Zealand? Or the future pathway for that in New Zealand?
Hello? I don't know if this is... At the moment, there currently really isn't a use case pathway for avoided emissions just yet. However, we all heard this morning what the Minister said, so let's hold him account to that. He did hint to putting biogenic CO2 in their carbon capture and utilisation and storage to have credits into the ETS. So I am hoping that would then enable us to have a mechanism to support really those avoided emissions within that. So let's hold him account to that, guys.
Super, thank you. I also have one other question that starts with for INSA. Is there a similar carbon intensity calculation methodology available in Australia or other countries that you were able to base the New Zealand one on? So I guess how relevant is it?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. We have not done this in a silo. So our wonderful team at Dustin and Toitu did a full international literature review and scan of what all the markets are doing around the world, and based our carbon intensity methodology off what's happening around the world. So it's definitely not done on its own. So I believe in Australia, Jared might be able to, there's the GO method, which is under development at the moment, and also aligning with Charlotte and the WBA and what they've been doing in on a global space. So absolutely not reinventing the wheel, no.
Fantastic. That's what we wanted to hear. Okay, thank you, Insa. We'll now move on to Eleanor Grant. Eleanor is a Bioenergy Association board member, and she is also from Becca. She's going to talk to us about some of the work that she's been doing in broader ways to take account of carbon when considering options for developing projects within New Zealand.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. So I guess I'm going to cheat slightly and look at all of those avoided emissions. So really take a different view. For INSA, looked at the carbon intensity if you're trying to compare one fuel with another. And I guess what I'm going to do is take that much broader view of carbon at an end-to-end view and say if you're to compare different technologies, what are the answers you could come up with and what are the carbon impacts across the whole view. So I'm going to cover a little bit today in terms of why you might want to look at carbon. I'm going to run through a couple of different, three different cases. If you took 50,000 tonnes of organics, what are the different options? What might happen to them? What emissions might you get across that full value chain? Transport, is it a big deal? Everyone's talked about it a lot from an economics point of view. What does it mean in the carbon landscape? And then come through with a few conclusions. So first up, overall, kind of using carbon in a tender process, why would you look at this? So for me, really, it's a lot of what people have touched on today. Carbon and organics, they're a really valuable feedstock. They shouldn't really be considered a waste stream. The ability to, when you actually take and have a look at, if you're going to look at an option where you say, what different what different technologies should I use, or what should I do with the organics that I have in my waste system? What's the best thing for me to do with them? If you do put carbon into that tender process and assessment, you can understand that really big, wider system view of the benefits of going out there. You could also have a look at the byproducts that might come out of this particular technology and then understand what the system benefits are in the energy or in other areas in terms of offsets. It means that you can line up, hopefully, with your broader climate resilience and sustainability policies, and it means that you add and understand that environmental impact in the comparison beyond just cost and technical feasibility. So I did want to say that the method and calculations that I'm kind of presenting today are based on work that we've actually done, supporting someone who is having a look at what they do with the organics and the different technologies in a tender process, but the case studies themselves are mythical and are based on just industry norms in order to provide some illustrative case studies for you today. We're obviously not sharing tender information live on the screen. So I think I just wanted to kind of emphasise that. So what options are we going to look at? So if we took 50,000 tonnes of organics and we collected them, what would happen to them and from an emissions pathway if we sent them to landfill and we had gas recovery and gas use, if we put them into AD and we had gas use and digestate use, or if we took them for composting and then we had compost use. So that fundamentally are the three different options that I'm going to look at and talk to. What are the different emissions across the transport and the processing and the final end use of all of these different products for this 50,000 tonnes of organics. So a little bit like the diagrams that Insa presented before in terms of when you're looking at where did the emissions come from, but I'm going to take all the way from the beginning of the cycle all the way to the end of the journey. So obviously we've got transport emissions to start with when you need to transport the organics. We've got processing emissions, and if you're talking about landfill, those processing emissions would include that the methane slip and the gas that you don't manage to capture. You're also talking about electricity consumption if you're talking about composting and you've got fans and things like that running in terms of aerating your compost piles. And then you've also got transport emissions for your products that go off to your end users, whether that's a digestate or a compost. And then you've actually got the avoided emissions as well. So we're going to have a look at that full system lens and say, if you were to be able to substitute what the products that you produce for a fossil version, what are those avoided emissions as well that you can include? So it's really going that full end-to-end to understand this evaluation. So first up, if we have a look at processing emissions. So this is landfill at a 68% capture rate, which is a current MFE standard number. Now, I know that there are a lot of modern landfills which actually do achieve higher rates than a 68% gas capture rate. But you would say even if you get significantly better capture rates than that, the emissions are still orders of magnitude above AD and composting. And I guess that's the bit that we want to say, that regardless of, because of the power of methane in terms of its potential, the global warming potential, even a small amount of lost gas is a huge impact from an emissions point of view. The reason I've got kind of two colours there from the composting bit is that the green one uses the MFE emissions factor for composting, but actually if you have a really well-controlled in-vessel composting, literature research would probably tell you that the number is probably a lot closer to the purple bar. So the other aspect to think about is actually what technology you're using. Open window composting is not the same as in-vessel composting, just like the same that landfill collection is not the same as AD. And so I think these are the things really here where when you're comparing these different technologies, regardless of how we can all manage to get, you know, some different useful products out the end, they can still have really significant orders of magnitude level difference in terms of remaining emissions just for the processing itself. So then let's have a look at the transport myth. Transport, obviously, from an economic point of view, is a big deal. But is it a big deal when it comes to carbon? So obviously, when it comes to landfill, it's a one-way journey in terms of transport. And so therefore, the transport emissions are less when you've got AD and you've then got digestate and you've got composting that you then need to have an onward journey as well. But if you remember the 30,000 tonnes of emissions that we had from landfill that were just the methane escaping from the landfill that we don't capture, the extra, few hundred tonnes that we've got of transport actually doesn't stack up from a carbon point of view. It doesn't actually have the same level of impact. If you want to try and actually get the emissions for transport for organics somewhere close to the same level of the emissions that you've got for landfill, you could transport it hundreds of kilometres before you're starting to get to the same level of place, which I think is where you can kind of say the transport myth from an emissions point of view is not the big deal that I think we need to think it is. And this doesn't even account for the fact that, not in the too distant future we'll be able to electrify a lot of our transport, particularly the smaller end of the vehicles in terms of smaller trucks. And so therefore, it won't even be that far into the future that transport actually needs to be an emissions issue. So then we have a look at product use. So in this case for product use, we have assumed that the landfills are actually upgrading the biogas to biomethane, and therefore you've got that natural gas offset in terms of emissions. For AD, not only do you have the natural gas offset emissions, which are obviously significantly higher because you've managed to get a much better yield on your organics for the AD processing technology, but you've also got the potentially offset of chemical fertiliser and sequestration use because you can get that carbon back into the soil. And then you're looking at composting, you've also got no gas yield in this case, but you do have the offset in terms of chemical fertiliser and sequestration when you get the carbon back into the soil. So once again, if you go back to the overall emissions profile in terms of processing, being able to get that natural gas offset, like was spoken about earlier in terms of Nelson City Council doing, being able to support process heat in the local hospital, these are the kinds of things where you can actually start to make a real difference with these gas yields, and you can really have a system-wide effect in terms of emissions overall. But the key thing I would say with these offtakes is that if you are to count them, if you are going to try and avoid some of these double counting risks, you do need to know that they're real. You do need to know that you're giving your biogas to someone who actually is taking the biomethane and they're using it instead of natural gas, and they're not building a new plant, And so I do think there is a risk here that you need to know that the places that you're taking these particular places, just like for composting, if you really want to claim that you're going to be avoiding fossil fuel fertiliser use, you do need to know that you're actually taking it to a place that is actually managing to minimise their fossil fuel use, and you're not just putting the compost into a place which doesn't actually use fertiliser normally anyway, and so you're just kind of generally using it as soil improver. So there is a factor here that if you want to make sure that you're looking at these and you are counting on them, that they are actually a true situation and it really is avoiding some of those other products being used. So overall, when we put all of the numbers together, obviously it spells a clear case for AD and a big difference across that whole system view, really. And the total view is really why I want to kind of make that full plug of organics as being a resource for our energy resilience, for more circular agricultural systems have been spoken about today. It really can make a big systems view as to how we contribute to hitting our emissions reductions. Just before I do some conclusions and kind of key takeaways, we do want to cover the fact that we need to understand the accuracy of all of the different data sources that we had. A little bit like when I put up the composting diagram and said there's the MFE emissions factor, which is generic. When you actually go into literature research and try and understand what the specific emissions might be for the different technologies that you've got to cover, you do need to understand that not all of the technologies that are underneath each bracket are necessarily equal. So unless you can understand whether your emissions are coming from, operating data versus a theoretical value, you do need to understand the kind of differences. The other thing probably to think about when you're looking at doing these kind of carbon assessments is what is coming into the future. And if you're looking at offsetting either electricity generation or if you're looking at transport emissions, you do need to understand the potential for the changing renewability of the grid or the increasing electrification of transport, and what does that actually mean when you're looking at sensitivity. So it's really sensible to be able to understand both the accuracy and the likelihood of some of these numbers to change, because if we're looking at these projects, we're hopefully building them for 10, 15, 20 years to operate, and we want to understand how these numbers might change into the future. So, key takeaways for me. Obviously, if we take a full system view and a system lens overall, the biogas captured from AD is really exciting as a fuel, and if we can use it to offset natural gas, we can really have some significant impact on our emissions overall across New Zealand. Emissions accuracy is really important when you're doing this kind of analysis, and also is making sure that the final end destination of those products are actually being used to abate fossil fuel-based equivalents, so that you've got real potential out there. And the other bit is really about the transport emissions are probably not the big deal that people think they are when you look at the whole system view and the potential of both getting those organics out of landfill, treating them as a resource, and also the fact that you can offset fossil emissions out there. So really bringing that system view together to me means that there's a lot of really wider benefits. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Eleanor. That was really interesting. I think interesting to see not only that information about the transport benefits, which is an argument I've heard before, but the quite different picture when you look at it from a whole system perspective. And I guess my question for you, as someone that works in this space, is how common is that people who are thinking about the options take that approach, as opposed to looking at a project by project rather than the whole system approach? Is that something people are aware of, the need to do it and the difference in results they get from doing it, or is that a new thing?
I actually think that it is a bit new to look at it full end to end in terms of the potential. It isn't, as you said, people have kind of discussed today, it isn't necessarily aligned up with all of the carbon accounting standards to be able to kind of take this view and look at the big picture in terms of system lens. But it is the opportunity, definitely, for both local government and central government to actually understand, if we've got these emissions targets that we need to hit as a country, how do we take more and more a system view to understand where all of the benefits are?
And I guess that, to me, that sounds like it ties in with the discussion in the previous panel, where there was a call for more guidance for councils on how they should think about the whole picture.
Yeah.
And I think there's a question here that links in with that. Can you say more about how we might get value from avoided emissions? Does it take a council or biogas buyer that takes those into account?
I mean, effectively it does, because if you're selling a certified renewable product, how do you bring that into your scope 3 in terms of that bit that goes out in terms of your product out there into the landscape? I think that is the bit that you can impact somebody else's. So I think the certification scheme, getting one up and running here in New Zealand is going to be a really big factor into that. But hopefully people can see also the economic value. I know that there are a lot of places in the agricultural space where they're starting to see, in the food markets, we've got consumer demand for much lower emissions products. If you look at a lot of the food manufacturers in New Zealand, the reason lots of them are moving ahead with their decarb projects are not because there is an actual policy mandate in terms of, it's not because of the price of the ETS in New Zealand. They're moving because of consumer demand that they lower their emissions. And so I actually think that this is the opportunity here to be able to get into that space and see that full value.
I know we do have some producers in the audience here. Does any of you who are kind of in the food sector or in the production sector have a view on that? Whether consumers, is there a pull from your consumers either in New Zealand or outside of New Zealand for evidence that the production process is as green as it can be? Anyone willing to put their head above the parapet on that? I'll take that as, oh yes. Do we have a microphone that can go over there? Coming your way. No, that they won't be able to hear you, trust me. No.
No.
Yes.
Yes, no. Oh, that sounds a bit better. So, Jack Bella, this is, I work for Fonterra. This is sort of forecasting a little bit the panel coming in a minute. But, yeah, obviously we have lots of international customers, Nestle, Mondelez, all of the big food sellers. And yes, there's huge pressure on us to reduce emissions. Short answer.
Great. That's good. Yep.
Ben Smith from TNG, also shortcutting half of the next panel discussion. Every market has segments within that market, and there are groups who are obviously willing to pay for a sustainable product. The mainstream of the New Zealand market will say they want to pay for a sustainable product, and then at point of purchase, not.
That's what I see.
So there's a very big difference between those two things. But you can build brand loyalty around a more sustainable product as well. So there is a not necessarily in the price, but in terms of repeat purchase, there's something that you can create out of that. It's what we think.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, Insa?
Happy to add to that. Hello. Happy to add to that as well. Just that anyone who's exporting to Europe, there is requirements there for carbon accounting of your products going into Europe. And they're obviously then selecting items that are lower in carbon componentry of that. So when we are thinking about monetising avoided emissions, although there's no actual component here in New Zealand to actually push that through on the ETS, there's opportunities through things like avoided emissions when if you're a big industrial process heat user, you could consume it there, and utilisation in putting it for exporting.
Great. Good to see. Okay, let's thank Insa and Eleanor for those presentations. Thank you.